The rain had started before dawn, turning the cobblestone streets of Savannah into slick, glistening ribbons beneath the heavy gray sky. Spanish moss hung damp and motionless from the oaks, and the scent of wet brick and magnolia clung to the air like a memory that wouldn't fade. Ethan Carter walked briskly down Abercorn Street, one hand shoved deep into his coat pocket, the other gripping an umbrella that did little to protect him from the cold drizzle. His backpack felt heavier than usual, as if weighed down by more than textbooks and sketchpads. At 24 he was 2 months away from finishing architecture school, if he could stay afloat that long. He hadn't planned to leave the apartment that morning. His mother's oxygen machine had been acting up again, and Charlie, his 13-year-old brother, had woken up screaming over the missing battery to a toy he no longer even played with. But the message had been too strange to ignore. Delivered by hand in an envelope embossed with gold script, the note had been brief and unsettling. Ethan Carter, you are cordially invited to discuss a personal matter of great urgency. The Lockhart Club. Noon sharp. V.L. He had read it 3 times before searching the name online. Vivian Lockhart. The widow of Randolph Lockhart, founder of one of the largest freight companies on the eastern seaboard. Dead 10 years now. She lived quietly if lavishly in an estate just outside of town, rarely seen in public since her husband's passing. The Lockhart Club was one of those members-only places with velvet curtains, ivory china, and the kind of staff that never made eye contact. It was the kind of place where Ethan didn't belong, and he knew it. Now he stood in front of its arched black door, rain pooling at his feet, unsure whether to knock or turn around and disappear into the fog of his ordinary life. Before he could decide, the door opened. A butler with a face like carved wood gave a shallow nod and stepped aside. Miss Lockhart is expecting you. The room was warmer than expected, filled with soft jazz and the scent of lemon oil and old leather. Vivian Lockhart sat near the fireplace, one hand resting on a cane carved from ivory, the other curled around a porcelain teacup. Her silver hair was styled into a chignon so perfect it looked like it had never once come undone. Her eyes, sharp and still, assessed Ethan before he even reached the table. You're punctual. I like that. Her voice was smooth with a trace of southern drawl, but her words were clipped and efficient. She motioned to the seat across from her. Sit. Ethan obeyed, unsure what else to do. Vivian studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You've got talent, Ethan. Your professor Harold Van speaks highly of you. But talent doesn't pay bills. Not your mother's medical care. Not the unpaid tuition. Not the eviction notice I know you stuffed behind the toaster last night. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body going taut. How? I make it my business to know things, she said, not unkindly. Especially about people I may want to invest in. He leaned back, trying to hide the flush crawling up his neck. Are you offering me a loan? No, she replied. I'm offering you a marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at her, waiting for some trace of humor. There was none. She continued, calm and deliberate. This isn't about romance. It's about legacy. My name. My estate. I need a husband in name only. Someone respectable, quiet, young. Someone without a past that will come back to embarrass me. You'll receive full financial freedom. Your mother's care, your brother's support, your tuition, handled. All I require is your signature. And your discretion. He didn't remember how he left. Only that the cold air outside had felt like an escape. The walk back to the apartment passed in a blur. Inside, his mother was asleep in her chair, the machine wheezing beside her. Charlie was humming, lining up crayons by color. Ethan stared at them both, her breath shallow, his brother's world fragile and small. He sat with his mother that night and told her everything. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, without looking at him, she whispered, I don't like it. But I don't like watching you sink either. If this buys you air, maybe it's worth the cost. The rain came again the next morning, gentler this time. Ethan returned to the Lockhart Club just before noon. Vivian was already waiting, her hands folded neatly in her lap. He didn't sit. He simply said, I'll do it. Vivian nodded as if she had known all along. Very good. We'll schedule the ceremony within the week. And Ethan, don't confuse kindness with weakness. I expect your loyalty. As he walked out into the gray afternoon, Ethan felt the weight of his decision settle into his bones. He hadn't sold his soul. Not yet. But he had rented it, and the terms were still unclear. The first time Ethan saw Lockhart House, it looked less like a home and more like something painted from memory, grand but crumbling, regal but exhausted. The wrought iron gates creaked as they opened, revealing a winding driveway flanked by gnarled oak trees and wild azaleas that bloomed despite the season. The mansion stood at the top of the hill like a sleeping monument, its white columns streaked with age and its high windows glinting faintly behind a veil of ivy. This wasn't a house built for love, it was built for legacy, and the burden that came with it. He arrived just after noon with one duffel bag and a heart full of conflicted silence. A tall man in a gray vest opened the car door without a word and gestured him inside. Ethan stepped across the threshold, greeted by the scent of beeswax, cedar, and something older, like dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The foyer rose 3 stories with a grand staircase that curved like a frozen ribbon. Paintings stared down at him. Generations of Lockharts, stone-faced and stoic in heavy frames. Vivian appeared at the top of the stairs in a navy dress that matched the stormy light pouring through the stained glass windows. "Welcome to your new home," she said without warmth, then disappeared down the west hall before he could reply. His room was in the east wing, spacious, cold, immaculate. A bed so large it made him feel smaller than he'd felt in years. Heavy velvet curtains that hadn't been drawn in a long time. A fireplace with no wood. And silence. Not peaceful silence, but a kind that hummed as though the walls remembered too much. The staff spoke to him only when necessary. Polite. Measured. Eyes always flitting to Vivian before answering any of his questions. He noticed how they stiffened when she entered a room, how their voices dropped as soon as she passed. One maid, Mary Beth, seemed no older than 20. Her hands shook when she handed him clean towels. "You're kind," she said once, barely above a whisper. "That's rare in this house." Then she excused herself before he could ask what she meant. Vivian summoned him every afternoon for tea in the sunroom, though they never really talked. She asked questions about his coursework, his brother's condition, his mother's treatment, but offered nothing about herself. Her voice was cool, her posture rigid, her gaze always lingering just a second too long. She insisted they attend public events together. Art gallery openings, charity auctions, and old money garden parties filled with people who wore smiles like masks. At one such event held in Lockhart House itself, the dining room glittered with candlelight and crystal. Guests moved through the rooms with practiced elegance, sipping wine and complimenting Vivian's antique rug collection. Ethan felt like a mannequin in a suit, standing at her side and smiling on cue. Toward the end of the night, an older gentleman with a slight limp and a voice like velvet raised his glass in a quiet, loaded toast. "To past debts," he said, pausing long enough for heads to turn, "finally being repaid." He looked directly at Ethan as he drank. Vivian didn't flinch. After the guests had gone and the last glass had been cleared away, Ethan wandered the east wing, where the hallways narrowed and the wallpaper yellowed. At the end of one corridor, past a dusty mirror and beneath a faded oil painting of a fox hunt, he noticed a door he hadn't seen before. Unlike the others, it had no brass label, no ornate trim. Just a thick wooden door with a tarnished knob and a strange coldness seeping through the frame. He tried the handle. Locked. That evening, over their usual silent dinner, he mentioned it casually. Vivian's fork paused mid-motion. "That part of the house is off limits," she said, her tone soft but unmistakably final. "There's nothing down there but mildew and bad memories." Then she returned to her lamb chop as if the conversation had never happened. But something had shifted. That night Ethan couldn't sleep. The wind outside hissed through the old glass panes, and the house settled with long aching groans. Around midnight he sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Music. Faint but unmistakable. A waltz. The notes drifted from somewhere deep in the east wing, haunting, slow, played on an instrument too old to sound that smooth. He followed it barefoot down the corridor, heart racing. The sound grew louder, clearer, until he reached the locked door. Just as his hand reached out to touch it, the music stopped. Silence reclaimed the air so suddenly it made him dizzy. He returned to his room, unsure whether the music had been real or imagined. But when he reached into his pocket to retrieve the lighter he always carried, he found something else instead. A small iron key. One he didn't remember picking up. One that felt far too cold for the warmth of his coat. The key sat on Ethan's nightstand for days, untouched but never out of mind. It became a weight in his thoughts, drawing his attention every time he passed the table. He didn't know where it had come from, nor why it felt so intentional, like something quietly waiting to be used. On a restless Saturday afternoon, while Vivian was attending a fundraiser alone, Ethan wandered the east wing again. The house was unusually still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The locked door yielded easily this time. The key turned with a click that echoed louder than expected, and the air that greeted him was stale, tinged with dust and something faintly metallic. The room beyond wasn't a cellar after all. It was an old study, preserved like a private museum. Dust cloaked the furniture, but the walls were lined with shelves of legal books and personal files. A faded photograph sat atop a walnut desk. Vivian, decades younger, beside a broad-shouldered man in a gray suit. Her late husband, Randolph Lockhart. Ethan turned away from the image, uneasy, and began leafing through the items on the desk. In the second drawer he found it. A leather-bound photo album, brittle at the edges. Tucked between pages of family snapshots and clipped invitations were folded newspaper articles, yellowed with age but legible. One headline read, "Local developer sued in landmark Lockhart case." Another, "Randolph Lockhart suffers stroke amid legal scandal." Ethan's stomach tightened as he unfolded the front page of a Savannah Courier from 1983. Architect James Carter accused of fraud, defaults on partnership. His father, James Carter. The man he barely remembered, who had died when Ethan was 6, whose name rarely passed his mother's lips. He kept reading. The article described a failed land deal that cost the Lockhart family millions. Randolph had sunk their assets into a waterfront project designed by Carter, a venture that collapsed amid claims of embezzlement and falsified permits. The aftermath had left Randolph humiliated and bankrupt. He suffered a stroke 3 months later. Vivian, it seemed, had spent the next 4 decades restoring her fortune in silence. Ethan sank into the old leather chair, the album still open in his lap. She had known all along. Not just his name but his bloodline. The invitation, the proposal, it hadn't been coincidence. She had chosen him deliberately. When he finally confronted her, it was over breakfast in the solarium, sunlight filtering through the tall windows onto plates of untouched food. He waited until she had taken her first sip of tea. "You knew who I was before I ever walked into that club." Vivian didn't look up. She stirred her tea with the delicate precision of someone who had practiced control for decades. "Of course I did," she said, her voice cool. "Justice takes many forms, Ethan." He didn't respond. He simply stood and left the room, the weight of her words trailing after him like a chill draft. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to the hidden study. He scoured the desk again, searching for something he hadn't seen. Behind the photo albums, hidden beneath a stack of handwritten notes, he found it. A legal folder stamped with the Lockhart family crest. Inside was a draft of a marriage agreement. It was dated 3 weeks before their wedding. The terms were clear and devastating. Vivian retained full control of all shared assets, investments, and properties acquired during the marriage. Any future inheritance from Ethan's side, including pending lawsuits or intellectual property, would be redirected to the Lockhart Trust. There was even a clause stipulating the penalty for premature divorce initiated by Ethan. Immediate eviction, forfeiture of all financial gifts, and a gag order. His hands trembled as he read through the fine print. The contract wasn't about love or companionship. It was about control. About sealing the past in legal permanence. He felt the walls of the house tighten around him, the grandeur of Lockhart House now revealing itself for what it truly was, a cage gilded in etiquette and southern grace. He spent the next several hours reading pages from a red diary he found in the bottom drawer, the pages written in Vivian's unmistakable cursive. But the words weren't venomous. They were sorrowful. Fragmented memories of sleepless nights, of visiting Randolph in the hospital after the stroke, of standing in courtrooms with shaking hands and a shredded reputation. One entry read, "I built this house again with my own hands, not stone but silence and dignity. No one helped me. No one cared that the world I loved was burned down by the man I once trusted." Another, written years later, said, "If I cannot undo the past, perhaps I can contain it." His son. His blood. Maybe that's what justice looks like now, not retribution but architecture. A marriage as design. No walls broken this time. Ethan closed the diary and sat in the quiet for a long time. It was clearer now, he wasn't just a pawn in a plan for revenge. He was the blueprint for a structure she had been building for years, grief shaped into strategy, loss forged into legacy. He had thought he was saving his family. But maybe Vivian had been saving something too, something long buried beneath lawsuits and sorrow. And the question now pressing into his chest was not just what she wanted from him, but what she wanted to become through him. The rain returned in early spring, a soft, steady drizzle that clung to the windows and soaked the moss-draped branches outside. Lockhart House grew even quieter, as if the weather had seeped into its bones. Ethan moved through its hallways like a man suspended between timelines. The discoveries in the hidden study had shaken him, but they also left questions unanswered, questions that pressed harder with each passing day. The diary had hinted at something deeper than revenge, something unfinished. He couldn't stop wondering what she meant by, "No walls broken this time." He knew there was more. And he suspected the truth lay behind the only door he still hadn't opened. The cellar had been locked for as long as Ethan had been there. It wasn't part of the east wing where the study had been concealed, nor the west wing where Vivian's quarters lay. It was tucked discreetly near the kitchen, behind an iron door so unremarkable it almost disappeared into the paneling. He had jiggled the handle once early on and found it bolted tight. But now, with a restless mind and nowhere else to go, he began searching. He didn't expect to find the key inside a hollowed-out book on a dusty shelf in the upstairs library. The volume was an 1899 edition of The Principles of Restoration Architecture, a choice that felt deliberate. The pages had been carefully cut to hide a small brass key with an ornate handle. He held it for a long time, turning it in his fingers, debating whether some doors should remain locked. But when the storm broke later that evening and the lights flickered with the wind, he took it as a sign. The key fit. The lock gave with a groan and a soft pop. The heavy door opened onto stone steps and a chill that smelled of mold, ink and something older. He descended slowly, flashlight trembling in his hand, until the cellar opened into a wide chamber lined with file cabinets, old drafting tables and shelves of blueprints sealed in glass tubes. In the center sat a cedar trunk bound with leather straps. He knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All sealed in delicate envelopes with dates written in elegant script. Some bore his father's name, James Carter. Others were addressed to J. Some to R.L. Each one bore Vivian's handwriting. He opened one dated May 12, 1978. "I waited for you at the pier. You never came. I suppose I knew you wouldn't, not really, but I had to try. I always thought brilliance would be enough, that your mind would choose me even if your heart wouldn't. I was wrong. And now I have to face what's left." Another, dated months later, was angrier. "You married her. After everything. You stood in court and acted like you barely knew me. You told them I was just a business partner. I wonder what she believed. I wonder what she would have done if she knew the truth." Ethan read in stunned silence. The letters sketched the arc of a relationship never spoken of in his family, Vivian and his father, once deeply entwined. A proposal refused. A partnership turned sour. A betrayal that spanned both business and personal lives. Vivian hadn't just been ruined by a crooked deal. She had been abandoned. Left behind not just financially but intimately. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not pity exactly but understanding. When he emerged from the cellar hours later, Vivian was waiting in the hallway. She didn't ask where he'd been. She just looked at him, the shadows of the overhead chandelier casting delicate lines across her face. "You found them," she said softly. He didn't answer. She nodded as if he had. They sat in the drawing room, the fire flickering low. Vivian stared into the flames, her voice barely audible. "I didn't just want revenge, Ethan. That would have been too simple. I wanted you here, under my roof, where I could forgive what I never could as a young woman. I thought if I controlled it, this legacy, this story, I could stop it from hurting." Ethan watched her carefully. For the first time she looked her age. Not the glamorous 72 she presented in public, but something more fragile. "Why me?" he finally asked. She didn't smile, but there was something like it in her eyes. "Because you reminded me of him. And because I knew you'd come into this house with both his blood and your own path." Over the next few days the air in Lockhart House shifted. The staff, more relaxed now, seemed to carry news on their shoulders like a quiet breeze. Mary Beth, who had once flinched in corners, now offered Ethan tea without trembling. Mr. Langley, the head steward, nodded to him like an equal. One evening he overheard two maids whispering in the hallway. "She's changing the will," one said. "It's all going to him." The other answered, "About time." Later that night, as Ethan passed Vivian's study, he saw her seated at the desk, pen in hand, scribbling a signature on a thick legal packet. She looked up. "Don't think this is mercy," she said with a dry edge. "I'm dying. That estate will be yours. Not because I want you to forgive me, but because it belongs to someone who understands what loss really means." She waved him away with a flick of her hand. "You can decide later what to do with all this. But you'll have to live with it now." Ethan left the room without speaking. For once he didn't feel like an intruder in Lockhart House. But he didn't feel like its owner either. Not yet. Only like its next chapter. The azaleas were just beginning to bloom again when Vivian Lockhart died. It was a Monday morning, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of day she might have chosen herself, orderly, unceremonious, without drama. The house nurse found her sitting in the study chair, eyes closed, fingers still resting on the edge of her journal. There were no drawn-out farewells, no cryptic speeches, no final games. Just stillness. And then silence. Her funeral was small. No press release, no extravagant floral displays. Only a few old friends, a couple of distant cousins from Charleston, and the staff who had served her faithfully for decades. Ethan stood alone near the back, not out of disrespect, but because grief, when complicated, tends to take the shape of distance. He listened as the pastor spoke of strength and tradition, of Southern dignity and perseverance. No one mentioned the trial. No one mentioned the heartbreaks that preceded the wealth. But Ethan felt them all echoing in every pause between prayers. The will came through days later. As expected, Lockhart House and the remaining estate were his. The attorneys were formal, their voices flat but respectful. Vivian had left a note with the deed, handwritten in her usual blue ink, the loops and sharp points unmistakable. Ethan, some debts are better repaid in grace, not vengeance. You gave me that, though I never asked. This place was built to preserve memory. But it became a mausoleum for pain. Do with it what I never could, turn it into something alive. V. He read it twice, then folded the page neatly and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew almost immediately what he would do. The house had always been a museum of unresolved history. Its grandeur belonged to a past that needed closure, not celebration. He contacted the Savannah Creative Renewal Foundation, a local nonprofit that provided spaces for artists and affordable living for adults with cognitive disabilities. Within 2 months, the estate was transferred to their stewardship, with Ethan's stipulation that the East Wing be converted into art studios and the West Wing into transitional housing. When the board asked about naming rights, he gave only one instruction. The building should honor the family name, not to glorify it but to finally heal it. They agreed. He used the remaining estate funds, what wasn't tied up in renovations or staff pensions, to establish a scholarship at the local university, the Vivian Lockhart Fellowship for Second Chances. It would go to one architecture student each year who had faced severe hardship or family burden. Ethan made sure the application didn't require perfect grades. He knew brilliance didn't always come dressed in straight A's. Life shifted quietly after that. He returned to campus not as the exhausted, uncertain student he'd once been, but with a clarity born of fire and time. He finished his degree and began working part-time at a local design firm, focusing on inclusive public spaces. In the evenings he volunteered at the center, what used to be Lockhart House. He helped teach basic drafting to adults with special needs, including a young man named Corey, whose fascination with bridges rivaled Ethan's own. On the first anniversary of Vivian's passing, Ethan took a walk down Azalea Drive. The house stood proud but changed. The iron gates were open now. Children played along the gravel paths. A mural had been painted on the garden wall, bright colors, abstract shapes, nothing like the somber portraits that had once stared down from the halls. A new plaque had been installed near the front entrance. It read, "The Lockhart Center for Renewal, in memory of what can still be mended." Ethan stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, letting the breeze brush through his jacket. The weight he had once carried, the shame of his father's legacy, the burden of Vivian's choices, the confusion of being both a symbol and a son, felt lighter now. Not gone but transformed. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed against the folded note still tucked in the lining of his coat. He hadn't removed it since the day he received it. Vivian's final words lived there, not as a haunting, but as a kind of quiet permission. Some inheritances are made of marble and money. Others of silence and scars. But the ones that last, Ethan thought, are the ones that change you from the inside out. Not all forgiveness needs to be spoken aloud. Sometimes it just needs to be lived. He walked back toward the city with a soft smile and the sound of children's laughter echoing behind him, the old house finally at peace. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.